For 5 years, Elias Vance was a ghost. A quiet janitor in the halls of the Seattle Federal Courthouse, his memory erased by a devastating car crash. No one knew the profound truth: the man pushing the mop was once the sharpest lawyer in the city. But the truth was buried deeper still. When a ruthless prosecutor, Victoria Shaw, made a simple legal motion, it cracked the prison of Elias's mind, forcing a terrifying flood of memories to return. Not memories of justice, but of betrayal and blood. He remembered the chrome bumper, the planned assassination, and the identity of the mastermind, his own brother, Thomas Vance, who now stood ready to threaten his young daughter Lily to silence him forever. Now, with the fate of a billionaire and the peace of his family hanging in the balance, Elias must step out of the shadows and risk everything against the powerful empire that stole his life. To support Elias's fight for justice and to keep following these true tales of courage, please subscribe to our channel. The Seattle rain was a constant collaborator in the atmosphere of the federal courthouse. It did not fall with drama, but with a persistent weary drone, streaking the colossal windows of the building and muting the daylight into a perpetual silver gray. This was the world of Elias Vance, aged 55. For the past 5 years, the steady rhythm of the mop, the low hum of the floor buffer, and the distant muffled sound of justice being meted out had been the totality of his existence. Elias was a janitor, quiet and meticulous, moving through the polished marble halls like a ghost. He wore the Navy uniform with a strange, almost ceremonial precision. Every crease was sharp, every button secured. There was no haste in his movements, only a profound, almost liturgical care for the surfaces he maintained. He moved the mop head in slow, deliberate figure eights, gathering the inevitable grit tracked in from the Seattle streets. This methodical slowness was not a symptom of age, but a shield. It was the only way Elias could navigate the chaos that lived inside the quiet chambers of his mind. 5 years ago, a violent, shattering event had stolen his memories, leaving him with a deep, echoing void where his past should have been. The doctors had called it severe post-traumatic amnesia, a neurological prison built out of trauma and confusion. The man who had once commanded rooms with effortless, sharp-witted brilliance now found solace only in the repetitive, straightforward task of cleaning. He could not recall the thrill of a legal victory, the intricate dance of cross-examination, or even the face of his wife before the crash. He knew he had a daughter, Lily, but the memories of her infancy and early childhood were simply gone, replaced by the blank slate of his trauma. The contrast between the man Elias was and the man he had become was a silent internal tragedy. He possessed hands that, though rough now from abrasive chemicals and labor, still moved with the innate grace of a conductor. His eyes, a shade of deep amber, held a distant intelligence that seemed incongruous with the task of emptying trash receptacles. Sometimes, when he saw the expensive leather briefcase of a passing lawyer, a fleeting electric spark of recognition would momentarily illuminate the darkness in his mind, a phantom limb-ache for a career he could not name. His sanctuary was not the mop closet, but the small, affordable apartment they rented near the waterfront. It was there he had the only tether to his former life, his daughter Lily. Lily, at 10 years old, had taken on the weight of their fragmented history with a wisdom beyond her years. Every morning before Elias left for his early shift, Lily would remind him of their shared ritual. She carried a small, tarnished silver pocket watch, a relic from the time before the crash. The glass was cracked, the hands frozen precisely at 9 o'clock, the time of the catastrophic impact. "Remember, Dad?" she would whisper, her small hand pressing the cool metal into his palm. "This watch is just asleep, not broken. Like you." He would nod, unable to articulate the depth of love and confusion her simple, brave words inspired. Lily was the custodian of his memory. She kept photographs, told him stories of the good lawyer he was, and ensured he completed the necessary paperwork to maintain his status with the Bar Association. He did the continuing education requirements online, mind-numbingly boring tasks that kept his legal license technically active. But he did them because Lily insisted. It was her hope, her small, unwavering belief that the key to unlocking her father lay not in medicine, but in persistent normalcy. On this particular Tuesday, the atmosphere in the courthouse felt heavier than usual. Elias was navigating the marble corridor outside courtroom 305, the busiest in the federal building where the trial of the century was unfolding. The defendant was Jonathan Hayes, the 45-year-old visionary founder of Nova Quantum Dynamics. Hayes had pioneered a sustainable energy technology that promised to revolutionize the global power grid and predictably had drawn the ire of every established energy giant. He was now facing massive fraud charges, accused of stealing the core design from a rival. The media buzz was deafening, amplified by the sudden dramatic abandonment of Hayes by his high-powered legal defense team. 6 attorneys charging exorbitant hourly rates had simply vanished overnight, leaving Hayes exposed and alone. Elias moved slowly, carefully avoiding the clusters of reporters and well-dressed legal professionals hovering outside the courtroom. He pushed his heavy cart, its rubber wheels silent on the wet marble. As he paused near the security checkpoint to refill his water bucket, he saw the moment coming. A young man in a bespoke suit clutching a stack of files, bound with a thick rubber band, rushed out of the courtroom. He had the pinched, perpetually stressed look of an ambitious associate. His name was Peter Carr, though Elias did not know it. Peter was focused on racing back to his office with some newly received documents. Elias's cleaning cart momentarily blocking the flow of traffic was an immediate offense to Peter Carr's important schedule. "Move the cart, old man," Peter snapped, not slowing his pace. His tone was dismissive, his eyes flicking over Elias as if he were an inanimate piece of courthouse furniture. Elias, startled by the abruptness, fumbled slightly with the bucket. The simple request, delivered with such casual disdain, scraped against the raw surface of his fractured memory, hitting that strange combination of competence and helplessness that defined his existence. "Excuse me," Elias murmured, pulling the heavy cart sharply to the side, his movements clumsy. Peter Carr stopped right in front of him, his face contorted in annoyance. "Excuse me isn't going to get these motions filed on time. Look at you. You're slow. Can't you do anything right?" "This isn't a retirement home. This is a federal courthouse. Try to keep up." The word slow. "Can't you do anything right? Keep up." Were not just insults. They were a cruel echo of the constant self-doubt that plagued Elias daily. He was a man who used to process legal arguments faster than anyone in the room, whose mental acuity was legendary. Now he fumbled with a mop and was reprimanded by a boy young enough to be his son. Elias simply lowered his eyes, his dignity forcing him to swallow the retort he could not form. The rage and frustration that should have surged were muffled by the amnesia, leaving only a hollow, cold ache. Peter, satisfied with his dominance, stepped around the cart, nearly shouldering Elias aside, and disappeared down the hall. Elias stood there, his hands gripping the metal handle of the cart until his knuckles were white. He took a deep, shaky breath, fighting the sudden, inexplicable urge to throw the water bucket across the highly polished floor. He couldn't. He needed this job for Lily. He was slow, and he had to keep up. He pushed the encounter away, forcing his mind back to the soothing neutrality of the cleaning task. He moved around the corner and approached the gallery entrance of courtroom 305, the air thick with tension. The courtroom doors were slightly ajar, and the sharp, clear voice of the prosecutor sliced through the noise of the hallway. The prosecutor was Victoria Shaw. She was known for her icy precision and ruthless ambition, and she was the same Victoria Shaw who had been a sharp rival and briefly a romantic interest of Elias back in his prime. But Elias only sensed a vague familiarity, a distant, unpleasant resonance in the back of his mind. She was addressing the empty defense table where Hayes's former lawyers should have been seated, aiming for a quick default judgment. "Therefore, Your Honor." Victoria Shaw's voice was clipped and confident given the gravity of the accusations and the defense's clear, willful abandonment of their client. Elias was slowly wiping down the brass railing near the entrance, trying to blend into the scenery. He tried to tune out the legal jargon, but a specific phrase hooked his attention. Shaw continued, her voice rising slightly in triumph. The prosecution moves to immediately invoke the doctrine of presumptive liability, arguing that the failure to appear constitutes an admission of fraudulent intent under the framework of Jensen Vastwood Meridian Financial, decided in the Federal Circuit in 1996. The moment the words presumptive liability and Jensen Vastwood Meridian Financial left her lips, something snapped inside Elias Vance. It was not a memory, but a sudden violent neural response. The world tilted. The familiar fluorescent lights of the courthouse exploded into a blinding white flash behind his eyes. A sharp, searing pain, unbearable, agonizing, shot through his skull as if a rusted lock had been violently forced open. His knees buckled and he dropped the rag. The simple, obscure legal precedent cited from a Federal Circuit case decided almost 30 years ago had been the key. Elias pressed his hands to his temples, his breath catching in his throat in small, desperate gasps. He fought the urge to cry out. He was no longer a 55-year-old janitor in a Navy uniform. He was 27 again. He was in a law library, the smell of old paper and dust heavy in the air. He was hunched over a volume of Federal Reporters, the exact page Victoria Shaw had referenced blazing in his mind. He remembered the specific footnote, the dissenting opinion, the way the majority had misinterpreted the language of the Jensen case, creating a disastrous precedent that he had vowed to fight one day. It wasn't just the case name. It was the feeling, the adrenaline, the absolute certainty of his own intellectual superiority in that moment of discovery. The sensation passed as quickly as it came, leaving him dizzy and shaken, leaning heavily on his cleaning cart for support. The silence inside his head, the blank nothingness, was gone. It had been replaced by a rush of thoughts, arguments, and facts. The pain subsided, replaced by a cold, clear, calculating certainty. The doctrine of presumptive liability was a dead-end argument easily countered. It was a bluff. He straightened up, his eyes now sharp and focused, no longer distant. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by a fierce driving energy. Victoria Shaw was still speaking, her voice echoing smugly through the partially open doors. "We believe the defense's actions speak louder than any future arguments, and we urge the court to rule in favor of the prosecution without further delay." Elias Vance looked down at the rag on the floor, then at the mop handle, then at his Navy uniform. He saw the condescension in Peter Carr's face, and he saw the triumphant certainty in Victoria Shaw's expression. He remembered the Jensen case. He remembered the specific legal error. And suddenly, he remembered a man named Thomas Vance, a man he had loved and partnered with, who had smiled as he signed a document that had sealed Elias's fate long ago. The amnesia was broken. Elias did not bother to pick up the rag. He ignored the aching throb in his skull. He walked slowly, deliberately towards the courtroom doors, his janitor uniform feeling less like a shield and more like a suit of armor. He had a duty to address the court. He pushed open the heavy wooden doors and walked into the silent courtroom. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 305 swung shut behind Elias Vance with a reverberating thud, silencing the murmurs of the hallway. Every head turned. The abrupt intrusion, especially by a man in a Navy maintenance uniform, was a breach of courtroom decorum usually met with immediate intervention. For a long, suspended moment, the court was silent, staring. The man who stood before them was not the slow-moving, apologetic janitor they ignored in the halls. Elias's frame, usually slightly slumped, was ramrod straight. The amber eyes, so often vacant now, burned with the fierce focused clarity of a diamond newly cut. His breath came in even measured drafts, a stark contrast to the desperate panting of moments ago. The amnesia had not just fractured, it had shattered, unleashing a torrent of stored knowledge and buried pain. The image that dominated his consciousness was not the Jensen legal precedent, but the face of his brother Thomas Vance. He saw Thomas in the pristine mahogany office they had shared, smiling a smile that did not reach his cold eyes as he slipped a set of papers across the desk in late 2018, the papers that had been the preamble to the staged accident. The betrayal was no longer a chilling void. It was a tangible, burning reality. Judge Harold Peterson, a man known for his rigid adherence to protocol, was the first to speak. He peered over his half-moon reading glasses, his expression shifting from confusion to cold annoyance. "Bailiff, remove this man," Judge Peterson ordered, his voice low and firm. "This is a secured legal proceeding. Mr. Vance, I appreciate the hard work you do to keep these rooms clean, but you are out of order." Elias did not move. He met the judge's gaze not with defiance, but with an authority that stunned the room into continued silence. "With respect, Your Honor." Elias's voice was deep, resonant, and entirely unfamiliar to the man who cleaned the courthouse floors. It was the voice of a masterful litigator, a voice built to command attention. "I am not out of order. I am entering an appearance." A muffled snicker broke out near the prosecution table, quickly stifled. Jonathan Hayes, the accused billionaire, looked up from his isolated spot at the defense table, his expression a mixture of confusion and profound bewilderment. Victoria Shaw, the prosecutor, stood up instantly. Her tailored suit seemed to bristle with contempt. She was stunningly composed, her face a mask of ambitious confidence, but a flicker of true recognition and sudden cold panic crossed her eyes before she crushed it. She knew that voice. She knew that stance. "Your Honor, this is an absurdity," Shaw declared, her voice sharp as glass. "The defendant's legal team has abandoned him, and we now have a member of the maintenance staff attempting to inject himself into a multi-billion-dollar federal fraud case. We move for contempt." Elias turned his focus, his gaze locking with Shaw's. The history between them, the brief competitive romance and the legal battles they had fought to a draw years ago, was suddenly raw and alive between them. "Ms. Shaw," Elias countered smoothly. "Ignoring the judge's gavel taps, your motion for contempt would require that I lack the qualifications to address this court. I assure you I do not." He approached the railing, separating the spectators from the legal area, his shoulders back. He pulled a worn leather wallet from the pocket of his uniform trousers. He extracted a thin, slightly faded card and presented it to the bailiff. "My name is Elias Vance. I am counsel, and I will be representing Mr. Hayes." The courtroom erupted into confused murmurs. The bailiff, a veteran of 20 years, took the card with a dubious frown and handed it up to Judge Peterson. Judge Peterson examined the card. He flipped it over twice. It bore the seal of the Washington State Bar Association and the name Elias Vance, Attorney at Law. He looked at the date on the card, then at the man in the Navy uniform. Mr. Vance, the judge, said, his voice now laced with genuine skepticism, "This bar card appears to be technically valid. However, you are listed as having ceased active practice in 2020, following your accident. I understand you have been a janitor here for the past 5 years. Shaw jumped in, seizing the emotional high ground. "Your Honor, this is unconscionable. Mr. Vance has suffered a traumatic brain injury and subsequent amnesia. His mental state is questionable at best, and he has not stepped foot in a courtroom as an attorney for 5 lost years. We are discussing a matter of global financial consequence involving novel quantum technology. He is wholly unqualified to proceed regardless of a valid piece of plastic." Elias kept his composure, waiting for the judge to look back at him. When he did, Elias spoke directly to the bench, his voice calm, confident, and utterly compelling. "Your Honor, the state. Bar of Washington permits me to retain my active status as long as I satisfy the requirements for continuing legal education, the same requirements every practicing attorney must meet. My daughter Lily, in her unwavering belief that I would recover, ensured those requirements were met every single year. My license is valid." He paused, allowing the emotional truth of Little's quiet persistence to settle over the courtroom. Furthermore, Your Honor, Elias continued, shifting his argument to the legal necessity my client, Mr. Hayes, has been abandoned. Under the Sixth Amendment, he is entitled to representation. The law does not impose a minimum number of billable hours, nor does it require a spotless memory to ensure a competent defense. If the court refuses to accept the only counsel currently available to Mr. Hayes, it is denying him his fundamental rights. And I assure the court Ms. Shaw's motion to invoke the doctrine of presumptive liability is a legally flawed argument I can dismantle in 10 minutes. Judge Peterson sighed, running a hand over his tired face. The logic was inescapable. Refusing the only available counsel, even a janitor, would create grounds for an immediate appeal. Mr. Hayes, the judge, addressed the lonely figure at the defense table. You have heard Mr. Vance's declaration and Ms. Shaw's objections. Do you, the defendant, accept Mr. Elias Vance to represent you in this matter? Jonathan Hayes, the billionaire who had built his empire on logic and efficiency, looked from the impeccably dressed, furious prosecutor to the calm, resolute man in the maintenance uniform. He saw the cold hostility in Shaw's eyes and the absolute clarity in Elias's. Hayes's reputation had bought him the best lawyers money could buy. Now, his only choice was a broken man who cleaned the floors. Yes, Your Honor. Hayes said, his voice low but firm. I accept Mr. Vance as my counsel. Judge Peterson hammered his gavel. Very well. Mr. Vance, your appearance is noted. However, the court has grave reservations about your preparedness. You will provide proof of your CLE compliance as required within 48 hours. Court is adjourned until 900 hours tomorrow morning to allow new counsel time to confer with the defendant. Shaw's face was a mask of furious disbelief, but before she could object further, the judge swept out, leaving the courtroom in stunned chaos. A deputy approached Elias and escorted him past the railing and the discarded mop cart to the defense table. The deputy looked Elias up and down before reluctantly opening the door to a small, windowless conference room adjacent to the courtroom. 15 minutes counsel, the deputy muttered. Elias sat across the polished oak table from Jonathan Hayes. The contrast between them was stark. Hayes in a custom-tailored Italian suit, Elias in his faded blue and navy maintenance clothes. Hayes leaned forward, his relief fighting with his ingrained condescension. Look, Mr. Vance. Thank you. I don't know what just happened, but thank you. I assume you have kept up with basic contract law. Elias looked at him not with annoyance, but with the cold, assessing gaze of a seasoned professional. Mr. Hayes, I was disbarred, or rather driven from the bar in 2020, not 2023. I was a senior partner at Vance Carr & Carr. I taught advanced constitutional law at the University of Washington for a decade. I understand how discovery works, and I certainly understand contract law. Hayes flushed a billionaire caught assuming superiority over a janitor. My apologies. It's just the uniform. The uniform, Elias agreed. His voice flat as a necessary reminder. Now we have 15 minutes. I need to see every document you have on the Jensen case precedent and its connection to the Meridian financial framework. That is Ms. Shaw's entire bluff, and we will call it immediately. Hayes nodded, pulling out a massive leather folio. As he began to explain the intricacies of the fraud charge, Elias listened intently, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. Hayes spoke of the quantum processor schematics, the stolen designs, and the impossible complexity of the intellectual property involved. Elias absorbed the technical data with chilling efficiency. His mind, fully restored, processed decades of legal and scientific knowledge, synthesizing it instantly. The only sign that he was still anchored to his recent past was a small, involuntary twitch in his left hand. Hayes continued gesturing wildly to a flowchart of corporate transactions when a small, insignificant piece of trash caught Elias's attention. It was a crumpled, used sugar packet, carelessly dropped by one of the previous lawyers, lying right next to Hayes's expensive pen. Without breaking eye contact or missing a beat of Hayes's complicated explanation about Nova quantum dynamics financial structure, Elias's janitor instinct took over. His hand moved smoothly, efficiently. He reached out and picked up the discarded sugar packet. He smoothed it out briefly, then quietly placed it in the breast pocket of his uniform shirt, the perfect, clean place for a piece of trash. The movement was quick and almost imperceptible, but Hayes, focused on the explanation, stopped mid-sentence. He stared at Elias's uniform pocket, then back at his face, which was once again focused entirely on the legal challenge. Mr. Vance, Hayes asked, confused by the interruption. Elias blinked, pulled back to the moment. The janitor had vanished, leaving only the lawyer. My apologies, Mr. Hayes. Force of habit. Please continue. You were saying that the prosecution is attempting to establish fraudulent intent using the timeline of the initial public offering in 2022. Hayes was profoundly unnerved. The man who was discussing multi-billion-dollar fraud was the same man who instinctively tidied up his trash. It was a bizarre, disorienting display of duality. Hayes took a deep breath, pushing the strange episode aside, and continued his summary of the charges. He explained that the prosecution's case hinged on the accusation that Hayes had sold stock in 2022 while concealing flaws in his technology, thus demonstrating the intent to defraud. They claimed the flaws were present because the initial schematics lacked a key stabilization algorithm, Hayes explained, tapping a point on his chart. They are using that lack as evidence of fraudulent intent, claiming I knew the technology was incomplete at the time of the offering. Elias leaned forward, his gaze intense. He reached out not to the flowchart, but to Hayes's financial ledger. He quickly flipped through the pages. Mr. Hayes, Elias said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The prosecution is making a critical, overlooked error. They are relying solely on the technical schematics after the stabilization algorithm was allegedly stolen. But they missed something simple, something elementary. Hayes leaned in closer, desperate. What is it? The offering prospectus. Elias stated, tapping the first page of the ledger. The Nova Quantum Dynamics Initial Public Offering Prospectus, filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission in October of 2021. Did that prospectus claim the stabilization algorithm was present, or did it only state the technology was pending final regulatory approval? Hayes paused, thinking. It said, pending final regulatory approval. Of course. We were always honest about the development phase. Elias smiled, a small, predatory smile that belonged only to a lawyer about to win a game of chess. Exactly, Elias concluded, the loophole wide open before him. If the prospectus stated the technology was pending final approval, then no reasonable investor could claim they were defrauded by the lack of a final component. The prosecution is arguing fraudulent intent based on fact, the lack of the stabilization algorithm. But the law of fraud relies on misrepresentation of material fact. There was no misrepresentation. They have confused a failure to deliver with an intent to defraud. Their entire premise is flawed at its foundation. Hayes stared at the man in the janitor uniform, speechless. This was a tactical insight his 6 expensive lawyers billing $6,000 an hour had failed to find in 2 months of discovery. You saw that Hayes breathed astonishment overriding his fear just by looking at the prospectus date. Elias stood up, pulling his uniform jacket straight. His face was resolute. I saw it. Now, Mr. Hayes, you have found your lawyer. We will proceed to dismantle Ms. Shaw's case, piece by piece, starting tomorrow at 900 hours. I will require every document you have, and tomorrow you will refer to me as Counsel Vance. Elias exited the room, leaving the stunned billionaire staring at the closed door, the faint smell of floor wax lingering in the air. The small windowless conference room in the courthouse now served as the temporary headquarters for the defense. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and the nervous tension that clung to high-stakes litigation. Elias Vance, having shed his janitor's uniform for a hastily purchased ill-fitting suit, a necessary concession to the court's expectation of dignity, felt the full weight of the past pressing down on the present. His mind, once a blank canvas, was now an archive suddenly brought back online. The legal knowledge was razor-sharp, but the memories carried the bitter sting of betrayal. Jonathan Hayes watched Elias with a mixture of awe and residual skepticism. The initial shock of being defended by a former janitor had given way to grudging respect after Elias's flawless performance that morning, where he utterly demolished the prosecution's motion to invoke presumptive liability just as he had promised. "Counsel," Vance Hayes began folding his hands precisely on the table. "I owe you an apology. Your previous lawyers, the expensive ones, spent 2 weeks arguing the definition of material fact. You spent 10 minutes, and the judge threw out Shaw's key motion." Elias accepted the apology with a curt nod, his focus already on the next phase. "An elementary mistake, Mr. Hayes. Their failure to read the Nova Quantum Dynamics prospectus closely was unprofessional. Now we must talk about the real case." He slid the corporate organizational charts across the table. "Ms. Shaw's team is not incompetent. Their motions are clumsy because they are built on a shaky foundation. I need to know why the most powerful legal firm in Seattle simply walked away from a multi-billion-dollar fee, and why they left you with a case file that looks like it was designed to lose." Hayes leaned back his eyes, dark with resignation. "You're asking me to admit the truth that my own board won't acknowledge. This isn't about fraud, it's about power." He then confessed the core truth, the reality Elias already suspected. Nova Quantum Dynamics didn't just create a new computer. We solved the problem of stable room temperature quantum processing. But the real game changer is the energy application. Our processors can generate continuous clean energy through quantum fluctuation at a fraction of the current cost. Hayes paused, letting the implication hang in the stale air. "It means we can power a small city using a device the size of a microwave oven. It means the global reliance on oil, gas, and even the established subsidized green technologies becomes obsolete overnight. We threaten the entire trillion-dollar global energy sector. And the ones who abandoned my case, the $6,000 per hour lawyers, they all have deep ties to the boardrooms of the old energy cartels." Elias listened, the pieces clicking into place with frightening speed. The Meridian Group. Elias stated not as a question, but as a confirmation. Hayes stared. "How did you know that name?" Because Elias replied, his voice flat. "The Meridian Group does not tolerate threats to its existence. They have a policy of controlled destruction. They crush the competition legally or otherwise, and if they can't buy you, they ruin you." Elias closed his eyes briefly, fighting a sharp, blinding stab of pure recall. He saw the gleam of the chrome bumper, the sudden impossible speed of the oncoming vehicle in the rain on Interstate 5 near Tacoma. He saw the glass shatter the world, spin into a kaleidoscope of chaos, and the last thing he heard was the sickening crunch of metal. When Elias opened his eyes, the memory was complete whole and utterly terrifying. "My car crash in 2020, Elias whispered, his hands gripping the edge of the table, was not an accident. I was driving back from a meeting where I definitively rejected the Meridian Group's aggressive attempt to purchase and absorb Vance car and car. I refused to let them control the firm, and I refused to betray my ethical standards." Hayes watched horrified as the truth rewrote the history of the man sitting opposite him. "They didn't just want my firm, Mr. Hayes. They wanted control over the patents we were filing for a local inventor. They couldn't buy us, so they arranged a collision. A very efficient, tragic accident designed to steal my memory and silence me permanently. My memory loss wasn't a medical complication. It was a success metric for their security team. The Amnesia was the Meridian Group's perfect weapon. It had turned a formidable opponent into an invisible janitor. Suddenly, the phone on the table, Elias's new cheap burner phone, vibrated with an incoming text message. It was a cryptic image of the exterior of the courthouse with a large, angry red circle drawn around courtroom 305. The message below read, "Stop digging in the dirt, Elias. It stains the uniform." Elias pocketed the phone, the rage now cold and focused. They knew he was back. As the sun set, casting long, dark shadows across the Seattle skyline, the media assault began. Victoria Shaw, always ready to pivot, held an impromptu press conference in the rain outside the courthouse steps. "We respect Mr. Hayes's right to counsel." Shaw stated into the microphones, her voice oozing sincerity that masked her professional fury. "But we must question the mental and professional competence of his new attorney, Mr. Elias Vance, a man who suffered a traumatic brain injury and subsequent amnesia following a devastating car crash in 2020. Mr. Purrs. Vance has not only been absent from the legal profession for 5 years, but he has been living a life completely detached from the complex financial realities of this case. She did not use profane words, but the subtext was cruel and clear. The man is damaged. Good's a janitor who doesn't belong here. The article that ran the next morning in the Seattle Post-Intelligencer bore the headline, "Mop or Motion Hayes Hires Amnesiac Attorney in Desperate Bid." In the small conference room, Hayes finished reviewing the damaging headlines. He tossed the paper down his expensive suit, looking suddenly cheap under the burden of the system's malice. "This is beneath them," Hayes muttered, running a hand through his hair. "Attacking you personally. It's disgusting." Elias, who was meticulously organizing the scattered files, a professional habit reborn, looked up at the billionaire. He saw the genuine distress in Hayes's eyes, the disillusionment of a man who believed hard work and innovation could shield him from the arbitrary cruelty of entrenched power. "Mr. Hayes," Elias said, his voice measured, "you are experiencing the world the way I experienced it for the last 30 years, except you have billions of dollars to cushion the blow. When I was your age, trying to make senior partner, the small mistakes I made were magnified. The small victories were dismissed. The system is designed to reward conformity and punish those who challenge the established order, especially those of us who don't look like the established order." Hayes listened intently, absorbing the lesson. "I had a successful practice, a beautiful home, a stable life." Elias continued, his gaze drifting to the window streaked with rain. "But I was always an outsider. They wanted to control me, and when they couldn't, they tried to erase me. The uniform I wear is proof that when power is threatened, the ethics and rules they claim to uphold crumble." Hayes, the man whose fortune bought him every privilege, felt a wave of profound shame and empathy. He had always taken for granted that the rules applied equally to everyone. I never understood that Hayes confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "I truly lived in a bubble of wealth. I thought if you had enough money and enough innovation, the rules simply favored you." He looked directly at Elias, the janitor, who was also the brilliant lawyer. "I never understood how the system could be weaponized against someone without privilege until it came for me. And even then, I only understood the financial cost. I didn't understand the human cost, the personal price you've paid." Elias met his gaze. "The human cost, Mr. Hayes, is everything. That is why we fight. This is no longer just your fraud case. This is my chance to prove that the Meridian Group failed to destroy me. And it is your chance to understand that the system you built your fortune in is deeply flawed." He pushed a stack of briefs toward Hayes. "Now they are going to try to block our discovery motions based on technical delays. They want to wear us down. We need to counter them with immediate filings. The Meridian Group is desperate, and desperation, Mr. Hayes, makes people sloppy. We will use their sloppiness to find the real conspirators, starting with the one closest to me." Elias paused, his mind flashing back to the cold smile of his brother in the mahogany office. The rage he had suppressed for 5 years was now channeled into pure, devastating legal focus. The person who truly sold me out was Thomas Vance, and he is certainly involved in this. Hayes nodded, his former arrogance replaced by grim determination. "What do you need me to do, Counsel Vance first?" Elias replied, reaching for his own laptop. "You need to trust a janitor to save your life. Second, we are finding every single email and financial record related to your brother Thomas. He is the weak link in the Meridian Group's chain." The rain, which had been a low, mournful sigh, now intensified, hammering against the windows of the temporary defense office. Elias Vance knew that if the Meridian Group had attempted to assassinate him, once they would not hesitate to try again, especially now that his amnesia, their perfect shield, was gone. He had to move beyond the narrow confines of the courthouse. His first step was to seek out someone he trusted, someone who could confirm the unthinkable. Elias drove his battered old sedan, the only vehicle he owned across the city, to a low-profile commercial district known for its small tech firms. He was meeting Dr. Ava Chen, a brilliant digital forensics expert and a trusted acquaintance from his past life. She had been one of the few who questioned the official police report on his 2020 car accident, whispering theories of sabotage that the police quickly dismissed. Ava's office was small, filled with glowing screens and the hum of high-powered servers. She was a woman in her late 40s, sharp-eyed with short dark hair and hands that moved with the rapid precision of a coder. When Ava opened the door, she stared at Elias, not the janitor she had occasionally seen in the courthouse, but the man from her distant past. Elias Vance. She breathed disbelief and relief warring in her voice. The real Elias Vance. "I saw you on the news, but I didn't dare believe it. I'm back," Ava Elias confirmed, stepping inside, "and I need to know the truth about what happened 5 years ago." They sat amidst the blinking lights. Elias recounted the crash, the amnesia, the job, and the sudden violent return of his memory. Then he presented the financial data linking Nova Quantum Dynamics' failure to the Meridian Group. Ava quickly pulled up the archived police reports and insurance claim files from 2020. "I always thought the police report was flimsy," Ava explained, navigating rapidly through old data. "The angle of impact, the velocity, it didn't match a simple lane change. It looked like a deliberate precision hit. But they ruled it negligence on your part." Elias leaned closer. "Check the payments. I need to know who paid for the silence." Ava focused, tracing the paper trail surrounding the investigation. After several minutes of intense silence, broken only by the clicking of her keyboard, she found it. A large, untraceable payment had been made to the initial investigating officer shortly after the crash, funneled through a shell corporation known for its ties to private security firms. "Elias, look at this," Ava whispered, pulling up a secondary chain of transactions. The shell corporation that paid the officer, it's owned by another holding company. And that holding company is named on the board of the Meridian Group. Elias nodded grimly. The crash had been a targeted assassination attempt disguised as an accident. The paralysis of his career and memory was the Meridian Group's ultimate victory. "Now we find the real killer," Elias stated. "The person who gave them the opening. The person who signed off on my fate." He pulled up the initial documents he had found, linking Thomas Vance's private accounts to the current Meridian fraud case against Hayes. My brother Thomas, he was my partner, my family. But he knew about the Meridian offer, and he knew I would refuse it. And he had motive. Elias closed his eyes, fighting through the emotional pain to access the memory. The memory returned sharp and clear. In 2017, Elias began his voice flat with suppressed pain. Thomas was secretly involved in a massive ethical violation. It was during the Cascade water rights case. He took a substantial kickback to allow a toxic waste company to settle for less than they should have, endangering a community's water supply. I discovered it. Elias opened his eyes, the memory turning his gaze to ice. I confronted him. I was going to report him to the bar, but he begged me. Family, I gave him a chance to fix it, to resign quietly. He did. But I should have known he wouldn't let it go. Ava looked at the corporate records, then at Elias. Thomas Vance, your own partner, your own brother. He was caught by you in an ethical violation years ago. He was fueled by fear of exposure and resentment of your moral superiority. Ava pointed to the transaction data. And look here, the private military contractor who staged your accident. They received their final payment from a fund controlled by Thomas Vance's personal wealth manager. Thomas didn't just sell you out, Elias. He arranged the attempted murder. The truth was worse than the amnesia. The lost years were the direct result of his brother's malice. Elias thanked Ava, his voice thick with emotion, and promised to keep her safe. He now carried two burdens: the fight for Jonathan Hayes' future and the fight for his own justice against his own family. Later that afternoon, the rain finally stopped, leaving the Seattle streets glistening under a pale, watery sun. Elias was walking back to the courthouse after filing a series of aggressive motions that had completely unnerved Victoria Shaw. As he crossed the street near the court entrance, a sleek, expensive European sedan pulled up smoothly to the curb beside him. The window lowered, revealing Thomas Vance. Thomas was impeccably dressed, a mirror image of the successful, charismatic lawyer Elias used to be. His face was a mask of practiced concern. Elias Thomas said, his voice dripping with faux warmth. I heard. It's a miracle. We all thought you were gone forever. It's been 5 long years, brother. Elias stopped, his hands clenching at his sides. He saw the cold smirk beneath the concerned eyes, the same smirk from the 2018 office. Thomas, Elias replied, his voice flat and steady, concealing the volcanic rage churning beneath. I remember. All of it. Thomas's composure wavered for only a millisecond, just enough for Elias to confirm his guilt. The smile tightened into a grim line. I'm not sure what you think you remember, Elias Thomas said, his tone softening into a patronizing plea. The doctor said your recovery would be complicated. You've been through a lot. You should be home resting. You've got Lily to think about. I am thinking about Lily, Elias shot back, every minute of every day. And I remember exactly what you did during the Cascade water rights case, Thomas. And I remember the car that hit me. Thomas leaned closer, the warmth gone, replaced by calculated menace. You should be careful what you claim to remember, brother. This firm is involved in a lot of serious, delicate matters. We have very powerful partners now. People who don't take kindly to old grudges or to threats against their business. He glanced pointedly up the street where a small, unmarked black SUV was parked, its tinted windows staring directly at them. You've been a wonderful father to Lily. Elias Thomas continued, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. A wonderful, dedicated janitor. I'd hate to see your new life disrupted. Lily needs you. She relies on that routine. Don't make me remind her how fragile that routine can be. The threat was clear, chilling, and brutal. Thomas was using Lily as leverage. He was threatening the one thing Elias truly cared about. Elias felt a cold dread settle in his stomach, but his legal mind took over. He had to be calm. He had to show Thomas he was not afraid. The only thing you ever cared about, Thomas, was money and avoiding consequences. Elias said, his voice low and dangerous. You used to be my partner. Now you're just the Meridian Group's errand boy. And you're involved in the biggest fraud case of the decade. Thomas scoffed, pulling the window up slightly. Go home, Elias. Go back to your mop. It's safer there. The sedan peeled away from the curb, blending into the Seattle traffic. Elias stood motionless on the pavement, his fists clenched, watching the black SUV drive slowly past him before accelerating. The threat had solidified the reality he was not fighting a corporation anymore. He was fighting his own blood. He pulled out his phone and immediately called Lily's after-school center, his heart pounding. He simply told them he would be picking her up early and asked that she not be allowed outside until he arrived. As he walked quickly back to the courthouse to gather his files, The rage that had been simmering finally boiled over, hardening into a resolve stronger than any fear. He reached the defense office and slammed the door shut. He grabbed a fresh legal pad and wrote in bold, angry letters, "The Meridian Group is paying for the consequences of Thomas Vance's unethical behavior." He sat down his brilliant mind, mapping out the next steps. They were not just fighting a fraud case, they were fighting a conspiracy that involved attempted murder and the destruction of a man's life. Elias Vance picked up his pen and began to write the first motion of his counterattack, fueled by 5 years of forgotten pain and the chilling memory of his brother's malice. His gaze, fixed on the rain-streaked window, held a single unforgiving vow. Thomas and Meridian will pay for every minute of the 5 years they stole from me and my daughter Elias, whispered his voice vibrating with grim determination. And they will pay for every drop of fear I saw in Lily's eyes. The fight had become deeply personal. The justice would be total. The counterattack was swift, methodical, and chillingly effective. Elias Vance, working through the night with Jonathan Hayes and communicating in coded messages with Dr. Ava Chen, began to peel back the layers of deception surrounding Hayes's prosecution. Elias's brilliant mind, once stifled by amnesia, devoured data legal precedents and corporate filings with insatiable hunger. Their primary target was not the fraud charge itself, but the judicial and legal architecture supporting it. Elias knew that if the foundation was corrupt, the entire case would collapse. Dr. Ava Chen, operating remotely from her secure office, had managed to penetrate the firewall of one of the law firms that had abruptly withdrawn from Hayes's case. What she found was damning. "Elias, it's not just Thomas Ava's voice," buzzed urgently over the secure line. "The money flows like a river through 3 shell companies, Cascade Holdings, North Star Ventures, and Pacific Trust. All 3 funnel up to the executive board of the Meridian Group. The links were everywhere." Ava detailed how these shell companies had made substantial unexplained payments to the former legal team just weeks before they withdrew, ensuring their silence and complicity. More disturbingly, these shell companies also held significant stock portfolios in the same energy sector entities threatened by Hayes's Nova Quantum Dynamics technology. Then came the deeper corruption. Elias Ava continued, her voice tight with disbelief. "I've cross-referenced the funding sources with the federal judicial disclosure filings. Look at this, a luxury condominium purchase made 2 years ago, financed by a blind trust managed by North Star Ventures. Guess who owns that condo? Elias didn't need to guess. Judge Harold Peterson." Exactly, Ava confirmed. The same judge who presided over the start of Hayes's case and was poised to grant Victoria Shaw's default judgment. He's compromised. He was part of the plan to fast-track Hayes's ruin. Elias felt a surge of cold fury. This wasn't just a legal disagreement, it was a systemic rot reaching into the very heart of justice. Next, Ava turned her attention to Elias's own past, the event that had stolen 5 years of his life. The fake records were meticulously hidden. Using the transaction records that linked Thomas Vance to the private military contractor, Ava managed to access encrypted files on the contractor's old server. There, she found the detailed planning documents for the vehicle-to-vehicle collision on Interstate 5 in 2020. The files included photos of the target vehicle, Elias's sedan, and calculated trajectories designed to inflict maximum neurological trauma without causing immediate death. "This confirms it," Elias Ava stated softly. "Thomas didn't just pay for your silence. He orchestrated the attempted murder. It was a clean hit designed to leave you alive but broken." Worse still, Ava discovered a series of communications between the private contractor and a doctor at the hospital where Elias was treated. Forged medical records were created, deliberately misdiagnosing the nature of Elias's injuries, attributing the memory loss to generalized trauma rather than a specific targeted neurological assault. The misdiagnosis ensured no follow-up investigation would ever occur and cemented the narrative of a simple tragic accident. "It's a perfect crime," Elias murmured, the bitterness of the betrayal cutting deeper than the physical trauma of the crash. "They stole my memory, my career, and my dignity. They wanted me to be a shadow that could clean their halls." As Elias absorbed the depth of the conspiracy, another more personal file surfaced from the same encrypted server. This was the most painful discovery of all: the financial wound. The record showed a massive untraceable wire transfer from a Meridian shell company, the same shell company used to finance Judge Peterson's condo, to an offshore account linked to Elias's wife, Sarah Vance. The date of the transfer, 3 weeks after Elias's accident, and 1 week before Sarah had left taking Lily and then returning her, claiming she simply couldn't cope with the trauma. Elias stared at the transaction record, his hands trembling. 5 years of believing Sarah had been overwhelmed by his medical tragedy was instantly shattered. The cold reality was brutal. She hadn't left because of his condition. She had left because she had been paid to do so. The wound was raw, immediate, and utterly devastating. The betrayal by his brother was professional. The betrayal by his wife was existential. He concluded that Sarah had accepted the payoff from the Meridian Group to disappear, severing the last meaningful link Elias had to his past life and his former prestige, cementing his new identity as the forgotten janitor. He pushed the painful file aside, channeling the anguish into action. The case against Hayes was now inseparable from his own quest for justice. He drove to the courthouse, carrying the evidence of Judge Peterson's corruption in a sealed envelope. The meeting took place in the judge's private chambers, a place of quiet power and oak paneling. Judge Peterson looked weary but maintained a facade of stern authority. Counsel Vance, the judge, began coolly. "I agreed to see you privately based on your urgent motion. However, any attempt to harass or intimidate the bench will be met with the full force of this court." Elias stood before him, the ill-fitting suit a badge of honor against the judge's custom robes. "Your Honor." Elias stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "I am not here to harass you. I am here to discuss the full force of the Federal Criminal Code." Elias slid the sealed envelope across the vast mahogany desk. It contained Ava Chen's financial tracing report detailing the exact dates, amounts, and shell companies that financed the judge's luxury condo purchase. The report made it clear the Meridian Group had bought the judge's loyalty 2 years prior. Judge Peterson picked up the documents. As he read the cold, irrefutable evidence, the color drained from his face, replaced by a sickly gray. He looked up at Elias, panic replacing arrogance. This is conjecture, Vance, a malicious fabrication." "It is not, Your Honor," Elias countered, leaning slightly forward. "It is a meticulous financial trail. And I can assure you every piece of that documentation has been securely backed up and shared with my digital forensics team. If I am found in contempt, or if anything happens to my daughter or me, this evidence will be released immediately to the Department of Justice and the media." Elias paused, allowing the gravity of the threat and the opportunity for redemption to settle. "You have a choice." "Your Honor," Elias continued, "you can choose to be the final corrupted pillar in the Meridian Group's conspiracy, face felony charges, and lose your license and your pension. Or you can choose to make one final ethical decision that serves justice." The recusal was the only way out. "Recuse yourself from this case, immediately," citing previously undisclosed conflicts of interest, Elias ordered. "Do it quietly. Do it now. We don't need your confession. We just need your absence." Judge Peterson stared at the janitor, at the man he had scorned and pitied, now holding his entire life in the palm of his hand. He slumped back in his chair, defeated. "Get out of my sight, Vance." The judge muttered, his career dissolving around him. "I'll file the recusal motion before the end of the day." Elias turned and walked out of the chambers, leaving the corrupt pillar of justice to face his own ruin. He had won a significant battle, But the emotional cost of the day, the proof of his brother's malice, and far worse, the certainty of Sarah's betrayal, left him feeling hollow, a brilliant engine running on fumes of pain. The fight for Hayes was now fully the fight for his own life, his reputation and the memory of the love he had lost. The swift recusal of Judge Peterson sent a tremor through the Seattle courthouse. The atmosphere had changed. The quiet confidence of the Meridian Group's legal team was replaced by nervous tension. A new judge, the respected and scrupulously fair Judge Vera Reynolds, was assigned. New judge, new attack. Victoria Shaw, realizing that her initial fraud motion had failed and her corrupt path was blocked, knew her window of opportunity was closing. She needed to disqualify Elias Vance before he could expose the entire conspiracy. She decided to attack his competence directly, using the trauma of his past against him. The next morning, Shaw filed an emergency motion to declare Elias Vance incompetent to serve as defense counsel, citing his history of amnesia and neurological trauma. This time, she didn't rely on clumsy legal precedent. She used Thomas Vance's planted evidence. Shaw presented the court with a dossier filled with forged psychological evaluations and reports detailing Elias's erratic behavior during the first year after the 2020 crash behavior designed to be perceived as instability, not neurological recovery. The core of her argument was brutal. Elias Vance, the janitor, was not merely rusty. He was mentally damaged, making his return an act of desperate, delusional arrogance. Your Honor, Shaw argued, her voice cold and professional. The court must protect the integrity of the process. The defendant in this case, Mr. Hayes, faces irreparable harm if represented by counsel whose judgment is demonstrably compromised. Mr. Vance's return is nothing more than a dangerous, misguided bid for personal redemption, jeopardizing his client's future and the truth itself. The emotional toll on Elias was immense. He was forced to listen stone-faced as his deepest vulnerability was aired in open court. He saw the doubt in the eyes of the jury pool. He was battling Thomas's malice in the open, fighting against the narrative that he was fundamentally broken. He countered Shaw's motion with legal precision, citing cases where individuals had returned to high-stress professions after traumatic injuries. But the personal attack stung him far more than any legal challenge. The pain of 5 lost years, the terror of waking up not knowing his name, the grief of losing his wife, the struggle to be a father to Lily was now weaponized against him. After the hearing exhausted and emotionally drained, Elias returned to the temporary office. He sank into his chair, the image of the massive wire transfer into Sarah's account flashing in his mind. The feeling of betrayal that she had sold their life for money was a heavy weight deepening the pain inflicted by Shaw's attack. Just then, his secured phone chimed. It was an anonymous encrypted text message. It contained no words, only a sequence of numbers corresponding to the time and date of a specific ferry departure, followed by the image of a single tarnished silver coin, a coin Elias recognized immediately. It was a souvenir he had given Sarah years ago during their first trip to Bainbridge Island. The coded message was from Sarah. Elias knew the risk was astronomical. It could be a trap orchestrated by Thomas or the Meridian Group. But the sight of that specific coin, a detail only Sarah would remember, fueled a desperate need for answers. He had to know the truth behind the payment that had shattered his memory of their love. Under the cover of a fierce evening downpour, Elias drove his old sedan toward the Seattle waterfront, leaving behind the glow of the city towers for the stark open expanse of the ferry terminal. The air was cold, damp, and smelled sharply of salt and diesel fumes. He found the specific spot detailed by the coordinates, the dark, empty deck of the terminal, just as the last ferry of the night was docking. A lone figure stood waiting, huddled beneath a thick woolen coat, watching the rain sheet down onto the Puget Sound. It was Sarah Vance. She was thinner than the ghost in his memory, her face etched with exhaustion and fear. The moment she saw him, she flinched, not in fear of him, but in fear of the world that now surrounded him. Elias walked toward her, the sound of his shoes scraping on the wet concrete, loud in the silence. He stopped 10 feet away, keeping his distance. There was no warmth, no sign of recognition of the love they once shared, only cold, hard confrontation. "Sarah," Elias said, his voice measured, containing 5 years of agony. "You shouldn't be here. You know what they do." "I know what they do, Elias," she responded, her voice trembling slightly. "I've lived with it for 5 years. He cut to the core wound. The confrontation, the Meridian Group wire transfer, $300,000 3 weeks after the crash. You left a week later. Tell me, Sarah, was the price of our life together worth that much money?" The accusation was blunt, brutal, and aimed directly at her character. Sarah's composure snapped. She covered her face with her hands and sobbed once, a dry, ragged sound of profound grief and shame. She lowered her hands, her eyes red, but burning with an honesty he recognized. "That money wasn't for me, Elias," she choked out. "Do you think I could live 5 years on that money? Do you think I could ever look at Lily if I had sold you out for a payout?" Elias was unmoved. "Then explain it. Explain why my brother knew exactly where to send the funds and why you abandoned me and then came back to leave Lily saying you couldn't cope." Sarah took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing herself to be calm. This was Sarah's truth. "Thomas came to me in the hospital, Elias, 2 days after your surgery. He told me the accident was intentional. He showed me the photos. He had teams watching the house, watching Lily." Elias felt a cold rush of nausea. "He told me he had secured the final documents. You were working on the files for Hayes's Nova Quantum Dynamics from your firm's safe. He said if I went to the police, if I told anyone, he would make sure the next accident took Lily. He was terrifyingly specific." She continued, tears streaming down her face and washing away the bitter Seattle rain. "He didn't want to pay me to leave you. He wanted me to buy back the documents. The transfer was for ransom, Elias. He demanded $300,000 to buy the silence of the private security team who had orchestrated the crash and to turn over the stolen technical file." Elias stared, the complexity of the betrayal twisting his understanding. "I didn't have that kind of money," Sarah whispered. "I had to sell everything. Our house, my car, all our investments. I liquidated everything we had built. The Meridian payment, the $300,000, was the final portion he demanded to give me back, the single most valuable thing in your case." She reached into her coat and pulled out a small, sealed, metallic thumb drive, a file so thin it could be slipped into a wallet. "This," Sarah said, holding up the drive, "is a pristine, date-stamped, uncorrupted copy of the Nova Quantum Dynamic Stabilization file. The one Thomas stole right before the crash. The one they claimed you fabricated. I couldn't go to the police because they were corrupt. I couldn't stay with you because Thomas and Meridian were watching us both, waiting for me to reveal my hand. I had to disappear to appear as a failed wife who couldn't cope, to protect Lily and protect this." The truth was horrifying yet liberating. Sarah hadn't betrayed him for greed. She had destroyed their life out of desperation and love, making the ultimate sacrifice to protect Lily and the crucial evidence. The shame she carried was not the shame of a traitor, but the burden of a protector. Elias's cold focus faltered. The agony of betrayal was replaced by an overwhelming flood of grief and understanding. He saw the truth in her eyes, the suffering of the past 5 years, written in the lines around her mouth. "Sarah." Elias whispered, his voice cracking, the name tasting foreign on his tongue after so long. "I had to leave Lily here with you because Thomas thought you were incompetent." A non-entity, Sarah continued, the words tumbling out. "He thought you were safe because you were broken. I was the one they were tracking. I've been living in hiding, waiting for a break in the conspiracy, waiting for a chance to bring this to you safely." She looked down at the thumb drive. "This is the proof that Hayes's technology was complete and unstolen at the time of the IPO in 2021. Thomas and Meridian stole it after the crash. This is the evidence that will destroy them both." She extended the thumb drive toward him. Elias reached out his hand trembling as he took the cold metal. The evidence felt heavy, not just with legal weight, but with the entire broken history of their family. "I only need one thing in return." "Elias," Sarah said, her voice barely audible over the drumming rain. "What is it I need you to promise me? This ends them. This ends the terror. This ends Thomas." Elias looked at the drive, then into the eyes of the woman who had sacrificed everything for him and their daughter. The anger at her betrayal was gone, replaced by profound respect and a renewed commitment to justice. "It ends now," Sarah Elias vowed. "They will pay for every minute." The final day of the trial commenced under a pall of unprecedented tension. Courtroom 305 was packed. Reporters who had once sneered at the janitor lawyer now scribbled furiously in their notebooks, recognizing they were witnessing the demolition of an American corporate giant. Elias Vance, dressed in a better-fitting but still modest suit, stood before the jury having successfully survived Victoria Shaw's competency challenge. He knew this was his last chance, not just for Jonathan Hayes, but for himself and for Lily. Final strategy. Elias had coordinated his final daring strategy with absolute precision. Dr. Ava Chen had prepared the digital presentation, a complex yet easily understood flowchart linking every conspirator. Sarah Vance, his former wife, was the ultimate piece of the puzzle. She sat inconspicuously in the back row of the gallery, wearing an anonymous jacket and sunglasses, the small metallic thumb drive, containing the original Nova quantum dynamics schematics, taped securely inside her coat pocket. Elias had instructed her to wait for his signal, a specific, seemingly innocuous phrase in his closing argument, before making her move. He stood at the podium facing the jury, his demeanor calm, his voice steady, carrying the absolute moral conviction of a man who had nothing left to lose. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Elias began, his gaze sweeping across their faces, "you have been told that this is a case about corporate fraud. The prosecution, led by Ms. Shaw, has painted Mr. Hayes as a desperate criminal who stole technology. They have also spent considerable time trying to paint me, your defense counsel, as an unstable, irrelevant man. I urge you to look beyond the titles, beyond the uniforms, and beyond the media noise. This case is not about fraud. This case is about conspiracy to commit attempted murder, obstruction of justice, and economic terrorism." He let the heavy accusation hang in the silence. Judge Vera Reynolds, seated on the bench, watched Elias with an intensity that promised zero tolerance for theatrics, but deep commitment to truth. The Meridian link was established methodically. Elias began 5 years in the past. We begin in 2017 with the ethical lapse of Mr. Thomas Vance in the Cascade water rights case, a clear pattern of prioritizing corporate profit over the law. When I, as his partner, discovered this violation, Thomas Vance faced certain ruin. He needed an exit strategy. The Meridian Group needed a man inside. Elias clicked the presentation remote. The screen displayed the financial tracing data linking Thomas to the shell corporations. Thomas Vance provided that access. And when Mr. Hayes's energy technology became a demonstrable threat to the Meridian Group's trillion-dollar investments, they implemented their controlled destruction plan. Phase 1. The removal of any legal challenge. He displayed the medical files Ava Chen had recovered. In 2020, my car accident was staged by private military contractors paid through Thomas Vance's wealth manager. My resulting amnesia was not a tragic side effect, but the intended outcome. I was supposed to be neutralized. I was supposed to remain invisible. The jury shifted uneasily, faces pale as they grasped the horrific scope of the conspiracy. Elias's lived experience lent chilling authenticity to every word. Phase 2. The corruption of the judiciary. The judge initially assigned to this case, Judge Peterson, received undisclosed financial benefits, a luxury condo purchased by the same shell corporations funding this prosecution. They bought silence and guaranteed a conviction. Victoria Shaw rose her face tight with professional horror, though she was still fighting. Objection. Your Honor, Counsel is making inflammatory, unproven accusations of criminal conspiracy wholly outside the purview of this fraud trial. Ms. Shaw, this is directly relevant to the bias and malicious prosecution of my client. Elias retorted, his voice rising, drawing strength from his righteousness. This conspiracy is the root of the fraud charge. Judge Reynolds slammed her gavel down once. Ms. Shaw, your objection is noted. Mr. Vance, confine your remarks to the documented evidence and the motive for malicious prosecution. But proceed. Elias nodded his eyes, never leaving the jury. He moved to the most recent betrayal. The prosecution's entire case hinges on the claim that Mr. Hayes sold stock in 2022 while deliberately concealing the missing stabilization algorithm. They claim this demonstrates fraudulent intent, but they were the ones who engineered the theft of that stabilization algorithm. He pointed to Thomas Vance, who sat rigidly in the gallery observing the proceedings. They stole the technology paid my estranged wife under the guise of a ransom to ensure its silence, and then used the very component they stole to accuse Mr. Hayes of fraud. This entire courtroom proceeding is a massive deliberate act of legal gaslighting by the Meridian Group to seize the Nova Quantum Dynamics patent and technology for themselves. Elias paused. He had delivered the narrative of corruption, betrayal, and attempted murder. He had connected Thomas the judge's and the false charges to Meridian's motive. He glanced quickly at Sarah in the back row. She was tense, her hand resting on the spot where the thumb drive lay hidden. The time was now. Elias turned back to the jury, his voice dropping to a decisive whisper. This was the signal. The prosecution's case against Mr. Hayes is based on a lie fabricated years ago. It has been held together by fear, by corruption, and by the sheer arrogance that they could simply buy justice. But as of this moment, we have exposed the rot. And justice. Elias declared, his voice ringing with finality, demands irrefutable proof of where the truth resides. The phrase hung in the air. Sarah, recognizing the specific word choice, took a deep breath. This was her moment of sacrifice. The chaos erupted instantly. Thomas Vance, seated in the gallery, realized the full implication of Elias's argument. Elias hadn't just exposed him. He had laid the groundwork for a federal RICO indictment. Thomas signaled Victoria Shaw with a frantic shake of his head. Shaw, pale and desperate, gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod to two individuals seated near the gallery exit. Two large men in slightly rumpled dark coats who were clearly not lawyers. Before Elias could transition to introducing the file, the two men surged forward, shouting a generic fabricated phrase about a security breach and scrambling over the railing towards the defense table. Their sole panicked objective was not to harm the judge, but to seize and destroy the documents Elias had just used in his presentation. The courtroom exploded into chaos. The bailiff yelled for order, drawing his sidearm. Jurors screamed, scrambling from the box. Security seized those men, Judge Reynolds shouted, slamming the gavel down repeatedly. The two intruders ignored the commands, rushing past the defense table, where Jonathan Hayes was frozen in shock. One of the men, seeing the inconspicuous woman making her way quickly toward the court clerk, realized she was the true threat. He pivoted and lunged toward the gallery railing, aiming directly for Sarah and the location of the concealed drive. The sacrifice and the evidence sequence unfolded in the terrifying seconds of noise and panic. Sarah, though terrified, was resolute. She pulled the small thumb drive from her coat pocket, keeping her body between the drive and the charging man. She knew she had to get the evidence to the clerk before being tackled. Elias, who had instinctively moved to secure the evidence binders, saw the intruder change targets. He saw the violent predatory lunge aimed at the mother of his child, aimed at the truth she carried. The years of amnesia, the shame, the slowness, all vanished in a flash of raw, protective instinct. Elias Vance, the former janitor, the victim of a conspiracy, was gone. Only the protector remained. Elias roared a sound of raw defiance and threw himself across the intervening space. He intercepted the larger man midair, tackling him hard against the wooden railing near the clerk's desk. The force of the impact was tremendous, knocking the wind out of both men. As they hit the wood, the intruder, desperate and thrashing, managed to swing a razor-sharp edge of the railing hardware against Elias's left shoulder. A sharp, searing pain shot down Elias's arm, but he held fast, pinning the man down his body a shield. He heard the grunt of the intruder and the immediate warm rush of blood spreading through his suit jacket. But the pain was secondary. He had secured the way. While the court security officers and the bailiff wrestled the first two intruders into submission, Sarah, shaking violently but unharmed, reached the court clerk's station. "File this," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking but utterly resolute. "Defense Exhibit Alpha, the original schematics." The court clerk, wide-eyed, took the small metallic thumb drive. Elias slowly pushed himself off the railing, his left arm hanging limp and his jacket visibly stained with fresh dark blood. The bailiff rushed over, securing the area. "Counsel Vance, are you injured?" the bailiff demanded. Elias ignored the question, his gaze fixed on Sarah. He saw the terror and the relief in her eyes and the small, triumphant nod she gave him, confirming the file was secure. Elias straightened, the adrenaline masking the pain. He straightened his tie with his good hand, his eyes burning with renewed resolve. This injury, this small sacrifice, was the final punctuation mark on the Meridian Group's conspiracy. The court was brought back to a semblance of order. The two intruders, revealed to be private security contractors linked to Thomas Vance's funds, were detained. Elias walked slowly back to the defense table, his composure flawless despite the growing warmth on his shoulder. He addressed the bench, his voice unwavering. "Your Honor," Elias stated, looking directly at Judge Reynolds, "the defense requests that the court take judicial notice of the physical attempt to obstruct justice by seizing evidence which corroborates our claim of a criminal conspiracy and attempted murder." He then looked to Sarah, acknowledging her sacrifice. "Your Honor, the defense is now prepared to rest its case. We have filed Defense Exhibit Alpha, which is the original date-stamped uncorrupted stabilization file proving Mr. Hayes's invention was complete prior to the theft orchestrated by the Meridian Group and the co-conspirators. The prosecution's claims of fraud are demonstrably false." He looked at the judge, his voice ringing with the authority of absolute truth. "The defense moves for an immediate judgment of dismissal with prejudice and requests that all evidence, including the testimony of the detained assailants and the financial records of Judge Peterson and Thomas Vance, be immediately referred to the Federal Department of Justice for criminal investigation." Judge Reynolds looked at the bloody shoulder of the man who had cleaned her floors, at the terrorized jury, and at the newly filed metallic drive. The evidence was overwhelming. "The court will review Defense Exhibit Alpha immediately." Judge Reynolds declared, her voice firm, signaling the end of the line for the Meridian Group. The silence in courtroom 305 was absolute. It was the silence not of a simple conclusion, but of a systemic reckoning. Judge Vera Reynolds, having reviewed the uncorrupted file presented by Sarah Vance, along with the corroborating evidence of the security contractor's attempted obstruction, spoke with slow, deliberate clarity. "The court has reviewed Defense Exhibit Alpha and the subsequent filings submitted by Counsel Vance." Judge Reynolds's gaze swept across the room, settling firmly on the empty prosecution table. "The evidence overwhelmingly demonstrates that the technology developed by Nova Quantum Dynamics was in fact complete prior to the alleged fraud timeline. The verdict was delivered with the full weight of the federal bench. Furthermore, the evidence presented regarding the undisclosed conflicts of interest involving former Judge Peterson, the financial payments orchestrated by the Meridian Group and its affiliates to the defendant's original legal team, and the attempted obstruction of justice in this courtroom moments ago leads to only one conclusion. This prosecution was founded on malice, corruption, and fraud. The gavel fell sharp and final. All charges of fraud against the defendant, Mr. Jonathan Hayes, are hereby dismissed with prejudice. A collective gasp echoed through the gallery. Judge Reynolds continued, her voice hardening. The court will immediately forward all evidence pertaining to the staged vehicle collision, the financial transactions linking Thomas Vance and the Meridian Group, to the attempted murder of counsel Elias Vance, and the corruption within the judiciary to the Department of Justice's Criminal Division and the Federal Bureau of Investigation for immediate full-scale criminal prosecution. The dismissal was not just a victory, it was a detonation. Outside the courthouse, the chaos was immediate and overwhelming. Reporters swarmed Elias Vance, but he moved through the throng, his injured shoulder supported by a sling, his attention fixed solely on Sarah and Lily. Lily, who had been waiting with a family friend, rushed into his arms, clinging to him with tears of relief. Over the next few weeks, the consequences were seismic. Thomas Vance was arrested attempting to flee the country. Victoria Shaw faced immediate disbarment proceedings and multiple felony charges. The stock of the Meridian Group plummeted, facing collapse as indictments were issued against several of its top executives. Elias, now fully restored and recognized as a hero, suddenly had his life back. But it was not the life he had left behind 5 years ago. Jonathan Hayes arranged a private meeting at his corporate headquarters, a sterile, towering edifice overlooking the rain-slicked city. Elias Hayes began, his voice filled with sincere gratitude. "You saved everything. Not just my company, but my life. And you did it for nothing but the principle of justice." Hayes slid a packet across the sleek glass table. The offer was breathtaking. "I want you back in the profession, but on your own terms. I am creating the position of Chief Legal Officer for Nova Quantum Dynamics. $5 million annually, substantial stock options, full control of the legal division, a dedicated corporate security team for you and your family." Hayes looked directly at the man who had cleaned his floors. "It is a mark of utmost respect for your character and sacrifice. You can have your old life back and 10 times more." Elias accepted the packet not out of greed, but out of courtesy. He opened it, reviewed the terms, and slid it back across the table. "Mr. Hayes," Elias said, his voice gentle but firm, "it is a generous, frankly overwhelming offer, but I must decline." Hayes was stunned. "Decline? But Elias, this is your chance to reclaim your life, to restore your wealth, your status." Elias smiled sadly. "The status I lost was the status of a partner in a high-powered, profit-driven firm. That life was built on fighting for the powerful, arguing over contracts and billions. The 5 years I lost, Mr. Hayes, taught me more about the law than 20 years in practice ever did." He stood up, looking out over the panoramic view of the vast city. "I cleaned the halls of justice. I saw the people who came through those doors, the disenfranchised, the ignored, the ones who had no voice and no access to the kind of justice your former lawyers represented. I was one of them. I wore their uniform." The decision was rooted in his personal trauma and his spiritual transformation. "I spent 5 years unable to protect my daughter from fear." Elias explained, his gaze softening as he thought of Lily. "I can't go back into that corporate bubble only fighting for the technology and the wealth. I must now fight for those who have no voice and no memory. I must fight for the dignity of the people who wear the uniform I just took off." Hayes understood instantly. The trauma had purged the corporate ambition from Elias, replacing it with something far more profound. "Then, let me fund the fight," Hayes proposed. "I will establish the Elias Vance Legal Justice Foundation, a $50 million initial endowment. It will be dedicated to fighting corporate corruption, judicial discrimination, and providing legal access for the working poor. You name the terms, Elias. You run it." This time, Elias did not hesitate. He accepted the opportunity to create a legacy of true justice. With the security threat contained and the legal battle won, Elias and Sarah began the long, quiet process of rebuilding their family. Sarah's redemption was not achieved through money, but through the courage she showed on the courthouse floor. There were no quick fixes, but the deep wound of betrayal began to heal, replaced by mutual respect and a shared commitment to Lily. They bought a small, modest home near the University of Washington, where Elias planned to teach again, using his experience to train the next generation of morally grounded lawyers. Lily received the news of her parents' reconciliation with quiet joy. She finally allowed Elias to open the frozen pocket watch. It was irreparable, but she no longer needed it. Her father's memory was fully restored. Weeks later, the new Elias Vance Legal Justice Foundation opened its doors. Elias, now Counsel Vance, once more prepared for his first pro bono case, a small environmental justice suit against a local factory polluting a low-income neighborhood. The Seattle rain was falling again, a familiar curtain over the city. Elias was heading to the courthouse, dressed in a sharp, dark suit, a man of wealth and power once more. The final scene brought him back to where it all began. He paused just inside the revolving doors of the federal courthouse. The marble gleamed and the air smelled of disinfectant and old paper. He saw a man younger wearing the familiar Navy uniform pushing the heavy cleaning cart. The new janitor, tired and focused, was just beginning his shift. The new janitor did not recognize the well-dressed lawyer. He was just trying to avoid blocking the flow of the morning rush. Elias walked over to him. The young man looked up, expecting to be ignored or told to move just as Elias had been by Peter Carr months ago. Instead, Elias Vance smiled warmly, a genuine, unforced smile that reached his amber eyes. He extended his hand, his grip firm and respectful. "Good morning," Elias said, his voice low and kind. "Tough shift today with the rain." The janitor looked confused, but took the hand. "Yeah, it is. But someone's got to keep the place looking good." "You're right," Elias agreed. He looked at the cart, the mop, and the uniform. He saw not an object of pity or scorn, but a badge of honest work, and for him, a reminder of the raw, simple truth of life. "You have a very important job," Elias stated, looking the young man directly in the eye, treating him not as an invisible servant, but as a colleague. "It's important to remember that justice doesn't care about the uniform. It only cares about the truth." He nodded, giving the new janitor the dignity that had been denied to him for 5 years, and walked away, ready to begin his new life, eternally honoring the humility he had gained when he was the man pushing the mop. And so Elias Vance found his redemption not in the halls of corporate power, but in the quiet dignity he refused to abandon. His journey reminds us that true integrity is not defined by titles or wealth, but by the quiet choices we make for those we love. The deepest form of strength often lies in vulnerability, and the greatest injustice can only be defeated by the purest form of sacrifice and unwavering loyalty demonstrated by Sarah. If this story of resilience and the enduring power of family resonated with your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Tell us what moment touched you the most in the comments below. And before you go, please like, subscribe, and share to support our channel and keep you updated with more true stories.